I'm Kaelan. I'm a game and narrative designer. I'm originally from Toronto, but I've been all over the last few years. I made a few games that I'm going to quickly run through in a minute. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago in media studies, and I'm writing a practice-based dissertation right now about playful world building. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a version of some of the things I've been thinking about over the last few years as part of that research. I'm one half of an indie studio called Never Done Games, which is making strange games in vivid worlds with unconventional mechanics. The game that we're working on right now is a sort of competitive monster battling game, but also a deconstruction of that genre where your creatures remember how you treat them and sort of judge you. And I'm also the lead organizer of the Queerness in Games conference. I know several of you are going in the fall, but to just shout out QGCon, it's happening end of September in Montreal. It's a rad space, and I would love to see people there. So I'll quickly talk a little bit about the games that I've made. I'm going to pass one of them around. In 2018, I made City Planning Department, which is a world building game about the sort of wonderful disorganization of city building. The idea is that you take on secret roles and form a sort of committee that plans a city, but you all have different motivations for what that city becomes, and it sort of becomes eventually more and more chaotic. It also has like a bit of an eldritch flavor to it. In 2019, I made this game, One Hour World Builders, which if you want to take a look and pass it to the next person, you can like sneak it up and down, as long as it gets back to me at the end, I don't care. One Hour World Builders is a card game in which you and your friends collaboratively build a world in under an hour using a sort of system of prompts, extrapolation from your life, and a system of sort of structured questioning. And this was my first foray into like explicit world building games. And then in 2022, I made a game called The Archipelago, which is a visual novel about tea and trauma, where depending on what kinds of tea you brew, different people show up at your cafe amidst like a chaotic changing world. And I actually made the world for The Archipelago using 1 Hour World Builders. So this was the first use of what I would call like playful world building methods for me in like a game making context. My thesis and my sort of broader contention I could summarize as follows. We have to take seriously the methods by which worlds are built. We have to create alternatives to what I'm going to call bureaucratic world building methods, and I'm going to talk a bit about that later. And instead, we can build worlds playfully. So I'm really interested in world building as a process, and I'm interested in intervening in that process and imagining alternate processes. And the practice element of my dissertation, which is still like very in early development, is essentially a web game or web application where you it's intended to be a kind of irreverent, playful version of a world building application. But first, it's important to really define what we talk about when we're talking about world building, what we mean. Because world building is such a strange term. It can mean at once the kind of process of making something and also the product. So something can be referred to as having good world building if it's for example, a book with a particularly evocative passage. World building invokes both kind of radical imaginative power, the capacity to imagine otherwise, to build worlds beyond capitalism, and a kind of meticulous attention to systems. So there's a sort of systematicity about world building that differentiates it from other forms of sort of imagination or speculative work. And world building is at once about sort of lore, about like knowing how the sewage systems in your world operate, and also about feeling, about a sense of place, about being able to imagine yourself somewhere. So when I define world building, I define it as the conceptual, organizational, and logistical process of systematically imagining a fictional setting. I want to hold these two sort of terms in tension together, that world building can be both systematic, that we can keep an attention to detail and an attention to sort of the how, and we can imagine things that are very different. We don't have to stick to what we know. We can imagine systems that work radically different from our own. And I also am really interested both in a sort of conceptual part of world building, speculation, coming up with weird ideas, and the actual work of once you have those ideas, how do you organize them? How do you onboard a new team member into your world? How do you, if you decide to revise your world, how do you go about doing that? How do you resolve contradictions? And how do you go about sort of editing the world that you've made? And as world building has become a sort of popular term and a popular practice over the last 10 years, we've seen this sort of like cottage industry emerging of world building applications and tools that are essentially a subset of productivity apps, right? So things like World Anvil, Campfire, Legend Keeper, Lore Forge, and Amsel Suite. Basically, these applications, and a lot of them are intended as much for GMs as they are for like game designers or people writing a novel. You input your information in certain categories, and these apps sort of purport to do the organizational logistical work for you so that you can do what's like really important, the creative work. But in looking at these as sort of counterpoints to the tools that I'm building, what emerged to me for them is that they're weirdly like managerial, right? Like you're essentially sort of coming up with these world details, putting them into like a file structure, into like what feels like a very old-fashioned like a database narrative or something. And as details accumulate, it becomes more and more frustrating to sort of navigate the interface, find what you're looking for, make sure that the information that you're looking at is free of contradictions. It feels like work, and it feels boring. And it feels like somehow you're a manager. And this is what I call bureaucratic world building. So for this kind of world building, the sort of unit of production is a world detail, like a thing, a place, a person, an event. And the goal is to sort of aggregate world details. There's a kind of threat of disorganization that lies at the edges of this work that you're sort of constantly trying to stave off through these kinds of organizational tools. In addition to the kind of like managerial problem that I was describing, I also see world building or bureaucratic world building as framing you as this kind of world manager, as an authority on your world, as sort of omniscient, as top down, as objective, as being able to define these world details and input them in this way. And I'm interested in kind of breaking down this conception, this relationship to your world, both because I find it like unfun and sort of increasingly difficult and frustrating, and because I think that it does something to our worlds to approach contradiction and inconsistency and challenge with this kind of attitude. And so this is why I'm offering sort of playfulness as an alternative. For playful world building, instead of focusing on sort of world details, we want to play with power dynamics. So instead of approaching when sort of inconsistencies or contradictions happen, instead of approaching those with a sort of desire to stave off disorganization, to make sure everything makes sense, we approach the not making sense with a kind of curiosity and irreverence. We imagine why it might not make sense and what we can like grow out of that sort of seeming contradiction, seeming inconsistency. Playful world building also often involves collaboration. It incorporates multiple perspectives, and in doing so, it opens us up to sort of vulnerability and helps us acknowledge vulnerability. And I think that what's really interesting about play and sort of game mechanics is this way that they let us be vulnerable by structuring the ways that we can contribute, and by like imbuing with excitement and delight like challenges and problems and tensions. So, like show of hands, who in this room has played at least one of these games? Great, excellent, okay. So I don't need to super introduce them to you. But world building games are a big inspiration for me. As you know, they're this kind of budding genre of tabletop RPGs that emphasize the sort of collaborative creation of a place over the sort of individual journeys of characters through that place. I encourage you, if you're making games and you want something that's sort of out of the box usable, use these. They're all very cool, and I have made settings for games using several of them. But what I'm going to do for the rest of this presentation is actually talk about how you can make your own world building game. These games all involve, like, if you look at them, you can see a kind of set of common tools and mechanics and practices that we can take. There's also other things that I've been thinking about that I want to kind of share, potential mechanics we could use. For the last few years, in several different sort of contexts, both working like with different game studios, doing my own like personal projects and also commercial facing projects, I have essentially, when I wanted to do the world building, made a game bespoke for that one purpose. So instead of taking something like a game that already exists and using those mechanics, like taking a quiet year or something, and building a world and making the game that takes place in that world, I begin by thinking about what mechanics are most useful to actually make the world that I'm going to make the game in. So it's like you make the game to build the world to build the game. So I'm going to quickly show like a few of like the results of some of these games. So this is I was working with Kitten Cup Studio on their next game that they're working on right now. And I came into the studio sort of from outside. It was me working with the creative director and the lead writer. And we had to come up with a kind of haunted version of the Toronto Islands. And so we sort of used this sort of collaborative map making. We used some sort of prompting. I built a bunch of prompts in advance. And we used it as a way to kind of align our vision and to lay the groundwork for sort of writing character development, outlining the story. So this sort of came at the very beginning. I also have used world building games in team contexts to create texture. So this is a sort of early world building game that I did for the monster battling game I'm making, Creatures After Calamity. And the purpose of this game was both to, again, like align our sense of place of where our game was taking place, and also to onboard a new member of our team. We had an intern coming in last summer. So to introduce her to the world, we let her sort of take part in building it. And what's interesting about this is that a lot of the texture and the kind of detail that we built in this game was not actually going to make it into the game, and we sort of knew that from the beginning. Rather, the goal was to create texture that we would have in the back of our minds, even if players would never see it. So sort of part like vision alignment and part team building exercise, I guess you could say. And this was I mentioned that I used my game 1 Hour World Builders to do the sort of initial world building with some friends for my game, The Archipelago. After that, The Archipelago was part of the Brain Minds residency, which was a virtual residency put on by the YouTuber H-Bomber Guy. And it was a kind of multimedia residency with participants working on individual projects across games and animation, and sort of comics, I think, like several media forums that were creators working on their own things. And I was writing The Archipelago solo, and I wanted to kind of meet these people, get to know them better, and also to feel like less lonely in that sort of exercise of solo writing. So I made this map. The conceit of The Archipelago is that it's a floating archipelago where you can't travel between the islands. And so I made this map of all of the islands in the archipelago, and I gave people carte blanche to like add detail to any of these islands based on a series of prompts that I made. And what's really funny is that the entire game takes place like on this. So you don't actually see any of this. So it was a really convenient way to like have give people the chance to add texture to a world without worrying about having to include any of the details they came up with in the actual game, which made it great for working with people, with strangers, people who weren't actually involved in the project. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to sort of throw out a bunch of different mechanics. I'm going to talk about what I see as 4 different kinds of categories of mechanics that I've noticed across different world building games, and sort of give you some of ideas about if you wanted to make your own world building game, if you wanted to jam a game for use in this way as a tool for a sort of broader imaginative process, what kinds of mechanics might be useful for you in different team contexts. I'm going to throw out a lot of ideas, so don't use all of them in one game. Like, please God. I mean, yeah, I look forward to seeing it, but I want this to be generative. I want you to like pick and choose, see it as like a smorgasbord, like see what interests you and sort of follow it. So the basic structure of most world building games, including One Hour World Builders, is you draw a card and you answer the prompt, right? And what's useful about this, I know Nat in their talk earlier today talked a lot about how prompts give people a very structured way to contribute, which can be helpful for people with less creative experience. And I think that's really excellent. It also builds randomness into the game, obviously. If you're shuffling a deck of cards, then you get a different order of cards every time. And so there's something exciting about that. But I also want to think like beyond this. There's ways and mechanics that we can use to like balance randomness with other kinds of player motivations. So for example, we could use resource management. You can have players have the option of either picking something randomly or choosing something that they know. When I was making the world building game for Creatures After Calamity, I'll go up here, players had the option of either they got to pick 2 prompts for each of their turn, and they could either choose both for themselves, or they could choose one for themselves, draw one randomly, and then they got to choose a prompt for the next player. So it became a kind of question of whether you want to dictate to other players what kinds of details they develop, to like give them a challenge or sort of play with them, or to sort of play with your own ideas and to like to have more sort of agency over what you get to make for yourself. That game also used sort of combinatory prompts, and I know the Deck of Worlds does this, where instead of drawing one card, you're drawing like 2 or 3. Maybe you draw like one adjective and one noun, and then you get to do that, and the sort of intercombination multiplies the possibilities. So you can also sort of do away with written prompts altogether. So I put tarot cards here as an alternative prompting mechanism. I've seen like essentially tarot spreads for world building, where instead of being prompted by writing, you're being prompted like by the meaning of the Emperor card. Different kinds of divination tools are really interesting sources of randomness that are not written. I've been thinking in general a lot about, like, as writers developing world building games, maybe one blind spot that we have is that a lot of our games require like writing and or speaking, being like articulate in how you describe things. So thinking about how we can prompt people in ways that are unwritten, that are sort of pictorial or like vibes based, and also taking advantage of the randomness of real life. So in One Hour World Builders, you start the game by drawing a theme card in which you extrapolate details from your own life as the kind of building block for a power dynamic in the world. So for example, you might get a card that says to describe something that you're afraid of, and then to imagine a world that is defined by that fear, where the sort of fear of that thing forms a core power dynamic. For example, if you're afraid of the dark, what does it look like to have a world that's afraid of the dark, socially, or something? So finding ways to sort of extrapolate details from your life and sort of leverage kinds of interactions that people have, I think is one way to bring in collaborators on your team to get sort of unexpected kinds of details and ideas. Another sort of thing that you see across world building games is a lack of focus on individual player controlled characters. A lot of world building games sort of do away with player characters entirely. And if you ever voice somebody in character, I think this is the case in The Quiet Year and also in I'm Sorry, Did You Say Street Magic by Kara Sirsian, you voice the community or the city, and you sort of in doing so are voicing multiple people at once, and it's not defined who exactly you're voicing or the sort of parameters of that. So this is one way to kind of dislodge people from the idea of individual stories and to bring them into the space to talk about sort of broader communities. I have also seen in Myerscough, for example, people sort of act out short scenes, which lets people sort of engage with characters, create characters, but then those characters get left alone and you never meet them again. So sort of one-off experiences where people can role play and then sort of move away from that. Downfall does something interesting as well, where they sort of alternate between characters. You have these in Downfall, it tells the story of the fall of a civilization, but it's told through the perspective of three individuals, and throughout the game, it's three players, everybody gets to experience each individual for a third of the game. I think the overall goal here is to get people away from feeling a sense of ownership over individuals. So in addition to kind of moving away from the stories of great people, of heroes, it's also about encouraging people to cede control over what they might think of or what might they want to think of as their own own characters. So another way to do that is to think about like non-player characters, to use the language of non-player characters as opposed to player characters, to think more about people in your world who are eking out a life, who are making do, who are sort of like scraping by, figuring things out, instead of people who are like pulling the levers of history. And if you want one really excellent example of this in the realm of nonfiction, there's a book called The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Tsing, which is an ethnography of the matsutake mushroom across the Pacific Northwest and Japan. And so she talks about how different kinds of communities in the Pacific Northwest have congregated around the collection of matsutake mushrooms, and in doing so have been pushed by sociopolitical forces, by climate forces, and by the sort of forces of international trade. Really interesting book, and really got me thinking a lot about imagining people sort of in the context of systems. Mapping. So a lot of world building games involve mapping, but are also really reluctant to do so because it's so easy to get bogged down into the making of maps, into geographical accuracy, into thinking about what's on every block of every street. And then before you know it, you're not creating a shared sense of place. You're like getting down into the details that really don't matter, and that aren't fun for you. So one strategy that a lot of world building games use to mitigate this is to create maps through play. So when you like take an action or when you come up with an idea, for example, in The Quiet Year, they do this. The map comes out in play. So you like draw a section of the map when something happens in that area that's important to you. I think this is one way to do it, but I also would love to see more world building games that incorporate different histories of mapping. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is heat maps, and the way that heat maps let us think of mapping as sort of spatializing dynamics more than like deciding geographies. So I'm talking, for example, of maps of like economic disparity, where like, to put it in really basic terms, like the rich parts of town are colored red and the poor parts of town are colored blue. This is one way to start thinking about maps as sort of visualizing contrasts and dynamics and different power, the ways that power becomes mapped out onto space. So I recommend looking into Psychogeography, critical cartography, topological maps, so like subway maps are like one other way of mapping that lets you think differently about space, and also about sort of pictorial maps. So maps where, for example, a country or a city might be represented by like a monster. This is a really lovely map that I found online and have been thinking about ever since, that was created by some middle school students at a summer camp in Ohio, where they mapped out the campus of Wesleyan University based on how things smelled, the textures, and like whether the smell was good. So like the stinky areas are like sad face, and the good smell areas are happy face. So what would it look like to like build a world with the smell map, with a good bad smell map? I don't know. I think it would be cool, and I think you should do it. Lastly, I want to talk about like cooperation. Inherently, world building involves people working towards the same goal of like imagining a place together, but sometimes being at odds with each other, disagreeing about what the world looks like, what it should look like, what you should and shouldn't do. And different games either surface this tension or create mechanics that leverage it, or they create strategies for sort of smoothing out tension. And you can take either approach depending on how your team works. Like I've said before, I think avoiding ownership of ideas is maybe the most critical element here. What you really don't want in your team is for somebody to say something that's incorrect and somebody else to correct them. And then that person feels like they made a mistake and they don't want to contribute again. So taking those moments of mistakes and thinking about them diegetically is one strategy that I think is really cool. Turning like misrecognition on the part of a player who maybe wasn't listening or didn't quite fully grasp what somebody else was trying to say into an actual disagreement in the world over what happened historically, like a misremembered history, or like one person publishing misinformation and the other person reacting to it. Another thing you can do is sort of make structures for dissent. So the Quiet Year does this with like contempt tokens that you put out on the board when you like, or people in the world broadly feel contempt, feel frustration with an idea. Another thing you can do is to leverage control. So in city planning department, like I said, everybody has a secret role, and everybody once per game has a veto, where if somebody has like a city thing that they want to put on the board, somebody can immediately veto it, and then we're not doing that idea ever in the game. But you only have one. So there's moments when you can take total control over the world building process, but that's a resource that you're managing. So you can only do it once. And then again, embracing its asymmetry and thinking about the ways that digital multiplayer games leverage asymmetry. So like I said, secret roles, hidden traitors, different teams. Like there's all kinds of sort of mechanics that you could pull from. Imagine like a competitive world building game that you have to play. Or again, like a world building game with one person who has completely different goals, who's supposed to come up with a world where the state collapses or something, but everybody else is just doing world building and doesn't know what the secret goal is. This is one way to like bring in different forms of expertise and different sort of ways of engaging with ideas that like makes that process fun. So like a few takeaways other than all the stuff I just threw at you. Overall, if you're gonna do this, you should think about using world building methods that match your creative and collaborative needs. So doing things that will match your team's strengths. For example, if you have a lot of musicians, think about ways to bring in sound into the world building process. Using mechanics that will engage with some of the inherent tensions that might be on your team. Number two is to take inspiration from design, like I said. And three, generally approaching worlds with curiosity, irreverence, and delight in details is, I think, how we build better worlds from a process perspective. What about digital tools? I'm going to make a dissertation. Like, come back to me in 2 years. I needed to plug it, but it's not ready yet. But thank you so much. I don't think we have time for questions, but please come up to my booth. And I have copies of my business cards. One of our road builders, I just finished selling out of the first edition, but I'm developing a second edition. So like, if you want to follow my Substack, I'm probably going to make an announcement pretty soon about that. Maybe print some more cards. Maybe you can get them. But thank you.